Hello, my name is Rex Hanger, and I teach geology and paleontology courses at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. Today, though, I want to talk about my hypothesis for the very first paleontologists of the Midwest. They predate me and any other professor that ever taught here in the Midwest, predate European occupation, really. And to do this, I have to make a segue into the world of archaeology, specifically effigy mounds, and then a specific type of those, the linears, which I'm going to present evidence to suggest that they are indeed representations of fossils. So first, let's look at the effigy mounds themselves. And what they are landscape features that are anywhere from a couple meters to many meters in length and width. Some of them will stand a meter or so tall. Most have been destroyed by weathering and agricultural practices throughout the Midwest, but where they are preserved, they preserve a menagerie of various animal images. So there are bird shapes, turtle shapes, panther shapes, bear shapes, buffalo shapes, many different things that we can interpret as animal shapes, and even some human shapes. But probably what's most interesting to me and what's most perplexing are the variety of various geometric shapes that are typically associated with these groupings. There are a bunch of oval shapes, conical shapes, and then the linear shapes. So in this map here, you see an assortment of various animal shapes, but then they've identified the linears. And in particular, look at this one here. This is what's called a tapered linear. It's a line, but it is wider at one end than the other. It tapers. The effigy mounds themselves are a point of pride for the citizens of these Midwestern states, obviously, and many of you have been to Iowa's wonderful Effigy Mounds National Monument, and it is proudly displayed on their 2017 quarter. And what they show here are their concentration of various animal shapes. Closer to home for me and for people at the Burpee Museum are the various mounds that are associated with the Rock River drainage. And north of Illinois, here in Wisconsin, in the area of the village of Koshkonong. The landmark book by Hugh Highsmith was published in 1997, wherein he details his history of these ancient earthworks here in Wisconsin, and then he gives a reprint of the true classic of the area, The Archaeology of the Lake Koshkonong Region. The backside of the book is what in particular interested me. You see an assortment of mounds outlined in white from this aerial photograph, and I've circled the tapered linear down there. In the book, there's a nice map showing the concentration of effigy mounds, particularly in Wisconsin, because the book was about Wisconsin, but it shows the bleeding into the surrounding states. The light gray pattern is the extent of the effigy mounds, and then the darker gray pattern would be where they are concentrated. And as you can see, they are concentrated along the natural drainages of the various rivers, large and small, in Wisconsin, and also a lot of our native lakes. These are places where today they are natural sites for observing actual rock outcrops and not just vegetation or forest or prairie. And presumably they would have been even more so in the time when these effigy mounds were made. The city of Whitewater, Wisconsin is like a lot of small villages in Wisconsin and other states that have sequestered off some small area that includes the mounds, where they are protected somewhat in a park-type setting. There's usually some signage to explain these things and to provide a map of them. And whitewater's no different. We have our bird shapes, our animal shapes, both birds with straight wings and swept back wings. We have what's called our panther mound, our turtle mound, and then the geometric shapes, including, as I noted, the tapered linears. And there's 3 prominent ones shown right here. This is no different for this area. Just down the road from us at the Burpee Museum along the Rock River is Beatty Park, where there are mounds preserved in the park. There's some nice signage explaining these things. And indeed, we even have displays on the upper floors of the museum that present little imagery and dioramas of the effigy mounds. But what are the linears? And this is the quote that really got me thinking years ago when I first moved to Wisconsin. The most puzzling question with the fewest clues is why the abstract linear and oval mounds resemble nothing natural, there's the key words for me, that we can imagine. Perhaps, as we previously noted, there is a simple explanation if we knew it. Well, simple explanations are not the modus operandi of archaeologists. Their hypotheses for these linear effigy mounds are a whole suite of things. They have been called the long tails of water spirits, whatever those are. They've been said to be the foundations for long houses, ancient sort of archaeological frameworks. Game drives, where if you have parallel ones, hunted animals would be driven, scared by some hunters to course down between them where others hunters would await at the end to kill them. Snakes as guardians of the underworld, in that sense that they are still animal effigy mounds, or that they are simply unfinished effigies. Someone started to make a turtle effigy mound or a panther mound, and they just never got around to finishing it. As for hypotheses of their purposes, those become even more expansive. They've been called markers to classify areas of control between tribes or tribal groups or family groups. Territorial markers to somehow mark property or some element of, oversight for a particular area. Defense structures, so that you could imagine certain Native Americans hunkering down below these mounds. They must have been much taller then for a lot of these purposes, but you could imagine them as defensive structures. Seasonal gathering places, maybe, and then a whole suite of religious reasons to placate the angry gods, seek God's favor, worship, etc., etc. Most of those fall into the purely spiritual aspects, and that's what most of the hypotheses of what they were and what their purposes were for fall into. In recent years, a lot of archaeological remains have become interesting to persons that are studying astronomy, astronomical observation, and there have been some efforts to map, even in the whitewater mounds in my town, the directions that they point and try to align them with various movements of celestial bodies. To no avail, really. Well, I want to propose a new hypothesis, and it really answers what Hugh Smith is saying here. So far as we know, nothing in a woodland Indian's daily life resembled or suggested the many mounds, the many shapes of the linear mounds. I want to say that they represent orthocone nautiloids. And there's some pictures of these fossils here. A lot of you have collected these things. A lot of you know what they are. Most of them in this area have a broken conical shape. In that sense, they are tapered linears, and they have prominent segment lines visible on them. So notice the tapered linear shape in these two photographs and in the cartoon area. What were they? So a little bit of paleobiology, these nautiloids would be like the living nautilus today, but instead of having a coiled shell, they grew a straight shell. So picture a squid-like mollusk at the large end of the taper of the linear object. Its body occupied this last outermost chamber, and then as it grew larger, it would successively wall off the back to create a larger living accommodation. This cartoon here goes from a living representation to various preservation styles as they would be found, and many of us around here, if you've collected fossils here, you've found segments that represent any part of this body fossil right here. The lines that you see that look like segments, they are the suture lines that mark the septal walls, that back wall of the creature. And we rarely find the entire fossil shell here. Usually you find segments, but even a small segment is enough to tell what this thing is. And more importantly for this hypothesis, it's enough to recognize the tapered linear shape. So, if you go collect fossils in this area, where do you go? Because of the forests and farmlands and prairies, there's not a lot of outcrop exposed, and most of us would go to a place like this. This is the Howes Brothers Quarry just outside of Fort Atkinson, very close to my campus. And here I've taken a class of students here to collect from these two formations. The upper formation, sort of beige colored, is the Galena Formation. And then the lower formation that's shown here with this grayish, bluish gray pattern is the Platteville Formation. When you go there to collect, you cannot help but find these fossils of these orthocone nautiloids. So here's two students happily collecting fossils of all suites of things, Ordovician things, brachiopods, corals, but I've circled here in red this long, it's about 2.5 feet long segment. Even in this far photo, you can see its tapered linear shape, and it represents one of these orthocone nautiloids. Typical days collecting will bring you many of these things. As I said, you rarely get the whole fossil, but you get various internal molds, some preservation of shelly material, again showing the tapered linear shape with the segments. The fossil here on the left side with the geologic hammer on it, the Estwing hammer, is that fossil that was between those two students in the previous picture. If we look at the geology of Wisconsin from our Geological and Natural History Survey of the state, we see that there's a prominent bedrock expression of the Ordovician and Silurian in the lower third of the state in this sort of arcuate shape like this below our Cambrian and then our central igneous metamorphic region. If we imagine what these Ordovician age rocks were deposited in, their environments, well, 450 million years ago, during this Middle Ordovician, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, the places where these effigy mounds are found today, would have been a tropical paradise in the tropics, but in the southern hemisphere, and indeed covered by shallow marine waters. Marine waters that would have had lots of organisms like this. So here's an Endoceras, and in the upper left picture there, a reconstruction, and then a nice image of swimming orthocone nautiloids above a shallow, muddy, carbonate, limey bottom. This is the imagery that's usually presented in museums. Indeed, in our own museum here, the Burpee Museum, in our Life in the Ordovician Sea display, there is the usual menagerie of Ordovician organisms, trilobites, brachiopods, gastropods, corals, but most importantly, swimming above them, these beautifully tapered linear orthocone nautiloids. Let's look again at geology of the Wisconsin area and the distribution of the effigy mounds. And you see the same general shape of these. The Ordovician and Silurian outcrop belt roughly mirrors the effigy mound distribution. And let's look again at that better map that has the concentrations shown along the water drainages and various lakes of the area. Now, I had some student do some preliminary mapping of this, but I'm going to have them do a more detailed GIS mapping, whereupon we look at the various bedrock layers. So here you've got the concentrations of the effigy mounds from that previous data shown as the greenish patterns. The Silurian and Ordovician bedrock are shown as the red and brick-colored patterns, and then all of the other older bedrock layers are shown in yellow. And again, you can see there's a rough correspondence, there's a good correspondence between the effigy mounds and the Ordovician Silurian bedrock, and then where these concentrations exist outside of that, they're along water drainages that connect to the Ordovician outcrop belt. Now, we know that the woodland people were indeed geologically focused. The Galena Formation is named for Galena, Illinois, and also its presence of the mineral galena within it. Galena and chert were widely traded by woodland people and other Native American tribes throughout the upper Midwest, as you see in this map, but also far away in parts downstream of the Mississippi drainage. So the fact that they were examining, looking at, using rocks, the earth, meant that one could consider them early geologists, at least in the sense of recognizing certain resources from the earth. But they're looking down. They're looking down at the rocks that maybe they first wanted for these mineral resources, but then they could not help but to see the Ordovician nautiloids there. Whitewater, Wisconsin itself gets its name not from any whitewater rapid action that is coursing through the Whitewater Creek there. Sadly, when I first moved here, that's what I expected. But indeed, it's more named for the Galena Formation, which is exposed as raw bedrock at the bottom of the stream, so that when Native Americans looked into the stream, they saw white water. Another sort of point emphasizing that they looked downwards towards the geology. So, why the nautiloids? First of all, I think there's a good case to say that the outcrop pattern of nautiloid-bearing rocks coincides very nicely with the effigy mound locations of all the mounds, but in particular the tapered linears. The tapered linears and the various lineared mounds have this nautiloid shape. That can't be denied. Another factor is that the sizes of these nautiloids, anywhere from less than a foot to several feet in length, is very similar to the sizes of the living organisms that they're expressing as these large multi-meter landscape features. So birds, turtles, panthers, various dogs and things like that, they would have sizes that are very similar to the nautiloid cephalopods that one would see in these outcrop areas. We also know that the woodland culture people were known users of rocks, geologists in quotations. And then what cinched this for me is the fact that they are the culture that is associated with the ceramic structures that are called Madison ware. And if we look at Madison ware pottery, this is a bowl a little bit less than a foot in total length that has these horizontal parallel lines at the top. Those are identified by archaeologists as representing the layers or strata of the earth, and then they've reconstructed this earth animal below. And if you look at each of their limbs, they are tapered linear features with the segmentation. It's as if they took various isolated, separated, tapered linear segments and stitched them together in an animal shape like this. As such, this is analogous to reconstructing a dinosaur like Jane from a pile of disassociated or randomly associated bones laying about. So they were doing paleontological reconstruction by making this Madison ware. And therefore, I think that these woodland Native American cultures, 700 to 1050 in the age, were our first paleontologists here in the upper Midwest. And they were doing reconstructive paleontology, just as we do today in imagery like this. They did it in Madison ware pottery like this. And of course, in the beautiful, large, tapered, linear effigy mounds.